What's up, everybody? It's me, Coach Mills here, and today we're going to be breaking down how to absolutely hard carry on Tank in Season 3. Tank is one of the most impactful roles right now, and as such, you can literally put an entire game on your shoulders. So we're going to break down everything that you need to do in order to improve at Tank, dominate your lobbies, and climb very, very quickly. But I've already private coached multiple tanks to Grandmaster, so if you want private coaching and to improve very quickly, check out my Patreon in the links down below, and let's jump into the video. Now, everyone knows that a tank's primary job is to make space or create space, but no one really breaks down what that actually entails. Now, space is basically the areas on the map that you want to position in, deal damage from, occupy, heal from, and control. I mean, it's basically every location on the map that you want to have you and your team to have presence of, and if you have space, then your teammates can move in and out of that area without fear of imminent death, basically. So the idea is, if 5 people of the enemy team are standing in one spot, you don't control that space, and if any squishy walks into that area, they're gonna die immediately. But if your tank is holding the point, you have 2 DPS on the flanks, and your support is right in the middle, you have that space pretty locked down. But it all starts from the front. It all starts from the spear or the tank itself. Now, the reason that tanks can specifically take space while other characters can't is that they have giant health pools that prevent them from insta-dying the second they meet their space or your team space with the opponents. If a freaking Zenyatta tried to take space, he would be met with instant death and just basically get deleted. And the reason is Zenyatta can only occupy areas that are already fully controlled space. He can't occupy contested space except for very specific situations, but tanks can. Tanks can always occupy contested space, like within reason. You don't want to be in the entire enemy team 1v5, but you can face opposition and not die immediately. Plus, you generate less ult charge from the enemy team and all that fun stuff. Now, this doesn't mean that you do it directly. A lot of times, tank players just want to push W, push right into the enemy team, and meet them head on, but it's going to really depend on what tank you are and how your tank specifically creates space. While a character like Reinhardt definitely wants to brawl, do damage to the enemy team, do damage to the enemy front line, and create space in that regard, a Winston creates space far differently. He jumps into the enemy backline very specifically, will bubble off and isolate a support, forcing the front line to peel back. The main tank will no longer be getting heals, and it will force the entire enemy to shell up and back up and try to go back for the Winston. And that allows your team to push up and claim the space that the other team is leaving or removing. And realize the more space that you can create for your team, so the more pressure and opportunity that you create for your team without dying, the more and more impactful your teammates can become. It's far easier for your DPS to take aggressive angles, which means more damage and more picks. It's easier for your supports to be under less pressure and capable of using their utility for more proactive things instead of purely defensive ones. This is why the tanking role can be the most impactful, because if you don't do your job right, it could be like your team are very constricted in their possibilities. But if you do your job spectacularly, your team will have the easiest time winning that, even if they're not really that good. Now, the second thing that you need to do if you want to dominate on tanks, this is a big mistake that I see with a lot of tank players, is they want to always be shooting or dealing damage to the enemy tank. They think the tank, or rather the tanking's job, is to just shoot the enemy tank. And while there is amounts of damage that you need to do to the enemy tank to prevent them from getting over aggressive, you really want to be dealing damage to squishes if at all possible. If you're a Zarya on the front line, oftentimes you're going to look for little off angles where you can deal damage to the enemy DPS that are pushed up, or even push farther back and try to get value, damage, kills on the enemy supports. If you're a Sigma, you shouldn't be constantly poking the enemy Orisa that is just immortal. You should be trying to poke away the enemy DPS on the high ground, put pressure on the enemy supports in the backline. This is not only going to apply more pressure overall, because you're dealing damage to things that actually have to respect your damage. It's not damage that they can ignore. It's damage that's going to force responses. You do a little bit of damage to an Orisa and she doesn't even care, but you do freaking a little bit of damage. And I say a little, like 100 damage to an Ana. She freaks out. She moves away. She nades herself. The cascading effect for damage that is being done to squishies is so much higher than it's being done to tanks. And the second most important aspect of this is that squishies generate you 30% more ultimate charge. Tanks have that passive. So if you're just poking the tank all day, not only are you actually creating less pressure overall, because all that damage is going to be trash damage that gets wiped away from heals, but you're generating ultimate at a much slower rate. So both things are lining up to you just not being able to, one, have the most impactful ultimates on the battlefield, which is the tank ultimates, and two, you're not applying nearly as much pressure as you could be. Now, the third thing that you need to have or do if you really want to succeed on tank is you need to not worry about the objectives. Okay, maybe that's a little bit of a lie. You only need to contest objectives when there is a meaningful reason to. And what do I mean by meaningful reason? The first one is if the opponent is about to cap an objective, like a core one. So this could be the ticks, like on King's Row, 1, 2, or the final one. Yeah, you definitely want to fight and contest objectives before they cap that. And as the tank, this is your job because you are the least likely to die when you're fighting in contested space. The exact same thing we talked about in the first point. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to always contest it. And that doesn't mean you have to stop them from giving ticks. This just means that it's your priority at the end, but not necessarily at the beginning. And this changes how you can play as a tank, because that means that you can go for plays, be aggressive, wrap around, try to get a pick, go for a play. As long as you're going to be contesting that objective, you do not have to be a slave to the objective. You don't have to only play by it and stop it at every single second, because the reality of a tank is sometimes you want to push and take space, but sometimes you want to back up and allow yourself to be healed, allow your cooldowns to come back. You don't want to always be fighting. There's times when you want to dip in and out, and it's okay to give up objective time as long as you're fighting the battles that matter. Now, the second thing that's super, super important here is making sure that if the fight is being lost, if you think the fight is going to get wiped, if you think it's very unlikely for your team to actually win the fight, then it's your job to close the fight out before the opponents are allowed to progress, because the progression does matter if the team fight is lost, because if you stop it and you prevent them from pushing the payload, hypothetically, you can have another fight before the enemy caps a core objective. Now, this doesn't mean that you just push straight at the car and just allow yourself to just all die. The second one person on your team gets picked, you're like, oh, fight's lost, let's go reset, let's go fight on the car and die on the cart so we get another refight. No, because as a tank, you can back up, you can give space while still applying pressure, allowing the enemy to, one, make a mistake, push forward too aggressively, and get themselves killed so you can level the playing field at a 4v4, or two, just constantly be poking away, dealing damage, preventing the enemy from pushing up too aggressively, and allowing a safe regroup by the other person that got picked before you refight. Now, I'm actually planning on doing a in-depth breakdown of some of my tank gameplay, showing you exactly how I do this step by step in a VOD. So if you want to see that, let me know down below and smash the like and subscribe. But let's move on to the fourth thing that you need to do if you want to carry on tank. And this is setting up your movements in chunks. Now, if you don't do this, you can never play something that is against a counter. Like, you'll never be able to play Winston against anything that is not super easy to dive. You'll never be able to play Ryan up against a good Sigma. What do I mean by setting up movements in chunks? Well, the idea here is that you're not immediately going from the place where you spawn or your controlled space straight into the enemies. You are specifically moving in little periods of time. So the idea is, okay, I'm Winston. Instead of King's Row attack, instead of just going and jumping right into the back of the point back on the enemy supports, I'm going to jump to the top right high ground, on their high ground. Here, not only do I get to occupy this area that the enemy Zarya is not occupying because they're on the low ground, but I'm still in line of sight of my team. And now the enemy automatically backs up because they know that I'm in a better position to walk around the high ground and drop on the enemy's supports. So the idea here is I'm already creating space, but I'm doing so safely. And then I can walk around, put myself in a situation where I drop on the enemy team with bubble. And if things get bad for me, I just jump the hell out. And the idea here is I create space, create opportunity for my team, but I'm not just jumping in, bubbling in, allowing the enemy team to just insta-kill me and punish me. I'm setting up my movement in specific chunks. And you can do the same thing for every single tank. If you're a Rhine, oftentimes you want to take the brawl to characters that can poke you out. Let's say a character like Sigma. You want to get into a situation where you're close to him at full HP with all your shields so you can block cooldowns, you can beat on him as much as you want, but he's not going to let you do that. He's going to whittle you down. He's going to do some damage to your shield. And if you get all the way to that Sigma, you pin in, you charge it, you get all the way up to him where you can beat on him, but you have no shield, it's broken, and you're half health, you're probably still going to lose that matchup. So the idea is you move to a certain location, an aggressive place, an aggressive location, and then you wait. You allow yourself to get full healed. You allow yourself to get full shield, and then you go in and push again. So you're taking the engagement chunk by chunk, allowing ample time for you and your team to get full health, your cooldowns back before you proceed in the next stage. And not doing engagements in chunks is one of the big reasons why you just can't find success on certain characters, and especially when you're playing up against counters. It's entirely possible to play Winston up against Reaper, or Winston up against Torb, or whatever bad matchup that you have in your mind. You just have to allow yourself to not all in instantly. While all in instantly will work against a composition that just crumbles when you do that, you got to give yourself ways in which to poke, create space, go in, jump out, and build up that ultimate to go for a more proactive play rather than just playing the same way against every single comp. Now, the last thing I got to tell you about Tank, and this is probably the most important in the entire video, and it's play your matchup properly. There's a lot of Tank matchups that you need to know if you want to succeed on Tank. Every single Tank has an effective range that they want to play in and an effective strategy that they want to incorporate. And as a Tank, you have to decide whether or not it's in your best interest to go for your own proactive strategy, to deny the enemy strategy, or find some happy middle ground. Because every single Tank is going to have good or bad matchups against the enemy tank and good or bad matchups against the enemy backline, and how you play needs to be very adaptable depending on what the enemy is playing and how the enemy is playing the matchup. But I can't really break down every single matchup in this video, unfortunately, purely because it would just take forever. But as a core understanding, realize that tanks have a sweet spot where they are okay being effective without using any sort of utility, and they want to play in that sweet spot, play in that pocket. But oftentimes that will come at direct opposition for what the other tank wants to do. Like, let's go to like a Sigma Winston matchup, hypothetically. Now, a Sigma wants to keep them far away, keep poking them down, keep applying pressure, and a Winston wants to jump past him, jump and try to dive the enemy team, get close in, bubble off maybe the Sigma rock or whatever the case may be, and try to split the supports. So as a Sigma, you want to keep yourself in that poking range, but conserve your cooldowns for when the opponent want to change and push into their optimal range. So this means don't throw your rock across the map. Don't throw your rock trying to get a random pick. Save your rock so that when the monkey jumps in, bubbles off your supports, you can push through the bubble, rock the Winston, save your supports, and force him to get the hell out of there. The idea is you are using your cooldowns to create or maintain your optimal effective range or scenario, whether that's poking from range, whether that's brawling the enemy team, whether that's jumping in. That's what the cooldowns are for. And if you're wasting cooldowns when you're already in your optimal range, you're not going to have them when the opponents force theirs. But this is like an oversimplification. I really could go in depth about every single matchup, and maybe I'll make a matchup video where I break down the matchups of every character in the game. That might be like a 30-minute video. So, yeah. Definitely let me know if you want to see that down below, and I'm sure my editor Shaden doesn't want to see that, but you know. But anyways, thank you so much for coming by. Smash the like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.